it is a bit of a weird thing having had my face on 2,000 houses across the local area. Because people sort of come up and they go, I think we've met. Did we go to school together? And you don't quite know how to tell them and say, look, you might have seen my face on your neighbour's house. And it's a fairly embarrassing concept, but one that you soon sort of get through. It's been a bit of a strange time over the last 6 to 12 months for me, going from just being a normal person to being someone who ran for Parliament and, you know, had a campaign that was actually received quite a lot of national media attention, which was something I wasn't really expecting, to be honest. Normally, when you put your hand up to run for Parliament, you put your name down, you run for pre-selection, you get endorsed by a party, then you kind of go around to some local community events and you say, you know, you shake some hands and you say g'day to people and you knock on some doors and then at the end either you get elected or you don't. But here in Kooyong we had a bit of a different experience and I lost. Out of 130,000 votes, I lost by 750 votes. So it was an incredibly close result for a seat that the Liberal Party didn't in fact hold. But in politics, there are no second prizes. No one gets a silver medal. You either win and you get elected as a Member of Parliament or you lose. And that is life. So I'm here to talk to you a bit about adversity, apparently. And I'm going to give you a few of my thoughts on sort of how to manage these things. But I'm sure, and it was very moving hearing some of the speeches earlier from some of the students and some of the things that you guys have been through. And I'm sure that many of you in this room, I feel almost like I'm not qualified to have this discussion because many of you in this room will have been through things far more difficult than things that I've ever been through. But nonetheless, I'm going to give you a bit of my thoughts. So, one of the stories that I grew up with when I was a child was that of my grandfather. He was born in the 1920s, and when he was 14, he decided he was going to join the Navy. And that was because he thought that there was a war coming. He thought we were going to go to war with Germany, and if there was going to be a war, he wanted to be part of it. And he sort of thought, he decided which service he was going to join, and he looked at the Air Force, and in the First World War, the average life expectancy for a pilot was something like 7 minutes. And he thought, no, that doesn't look too good. Don't want to do that. And he looked at the army and he went, it seems a bit dirty. You know, he's sort of a bit down in the mud and I'm not keen to do that. So he went, you know what, I'm going to join the Navy. And he joined the Navy and he went to the Royal Naval College here in Australia at age 14. So he studied at school and then left, and left at 14 to join the Navy. By the time he was 17, he was commissioned as a midshipman and he was sent off to war in the Second World War. And a couple of years later, he would have been 21 years old, so really not much older than you guys, because that time it does go quickly, believe me. He was on a ship in the Pacific Ocean during a battle called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And this was one of the significant battles of the Pacific, and his job was as air defence officer. So he was a lieutenant, and his job was to make sure that when the planes flew over and started shooting at the ship, that the sailors all shot back, and that they stayed manning their posts, and that they took down as many Japanese planes as they possibly could. And he was there on the ship called HMAS Australia, and basically the Japanese planes, the alarm went off and the Japanese planes were coming and they said, okay, they're flying overhead, they started shooting. And then suddenly something really strange happened, because this Japanese plane didn't just shoot at the ship. The Japanese plane actually flew into the ship. And this was the first time that this had happened. It was called a kamikaze. Some of you might have heard about this, but this was a deliberate technique that they used to actually use the plane as a bomb. And the first one, they thought maybe this was an accident. There was chaos, alarms going off, things going everywhere, people running around. They thought maybe it was an accident, until the second plane hit the ship. And they said, this is an accident. And at that moment, every sailor who was supposed to be manning those guns ran. They ran down under the ship, and leaving the ship completely defenceless. My grandfather, 20 years old, was standing there on the deck of that ship. And he had a moment where he thought, what do I do? Do I go under the ship with the rest of the men? Do I take cover? Given what has happened is something that is completely unprecedented, completely crazy. These planes have deliberately flown into the ship. And for whatever reason, he decided that in that moment, he wouldn't do that. In that moment, he would show leadership. And he went back. And he went by himself and took the controls of one of the guns and started firing at the Japanese planes ahead. And he said to the sailors, you need to come up now too, and you need to join me. So the sailors joined him, and they were all up there. And then the planes continued to fly overhead. And he ran. He said he had this moment. What he decided he needed to do is show people that he was not afraid. He'd done it once, but he said, if I wanted to keep those men in place because they keep getting scared, they're worried that they can't be there, I need to do something else to show that I am not afraid, and then they cannot be afraid. So he ran up to the bridge of the ship, and he stood on top of the bridge. And at that moment, a plane flew. And apparently it flew within half a metre of his head. And he stood there and he shook his fist at it. And it flew past, and it was firing the entire time. And in that moment, the other people on the ship realised that they could do it too. If this guy who was 20 years old, who normally was an officer standing behind the sailors and the sailors were doing all their work, was able to do that, they could do it too. And for that reason, he was given a Distinguished Service Cross. He was supposed to be given a VC, but his VC was cancelled by the Americans because they didn't want it to be widely known how much of a threat, how much of a risk these kamikazes were and how terrifying they were. They wanted to keep it all quiet, so they downgraded his award. But when you hear a story like that, someone, again, not much older than people in this room, I don't know, if I was put in that position, would I be able to do this same thing? But the big question I ask myself is, well, how does someone get to a point where they can be put in a situation of such adversity and they respond in that way? How do we do that? And I think there's a few kind of lessons that I've, from my limited experience of doing hard things and seeing other people do hard things, that I think are really, really important. The first one is it's really, really important to take everything that happens in your life, which may not be good, as an opportunity to build resilience when you can. A lot of things won't go right in your life. What matters is how you deal with them. You might have stuff happen at home. You might have setbacks, challenges, and sometimes you're just going to massively stuff up. I know I have. I mean, if I look back on my life, when I went to university, I went to Oxford. I ran for Vice President of the Student Union. I lost. I was the editor of the Oxford student newspaper. I got fired. In my first job, I almost got fired because I got in a lift and I was talking to a friend. We were going to this presentation. This German company, really, really boring German company, was doing a it was sort of industrial company. I had no idea what they did, but I was told, we've got to go, everyone go. I said, okay. Got in the lift and I turned to my friend and I said, oh, God, I really don't want to sit through this presentation. I'm honestly just going for the lunch. And then my friend looked at me and I looked at her, and we realised that the CEO of this company was standing right behind me. And as I entered the room, I just thought, I am completely cactus. And luckily the people responsible for that relationship were quite nice about it. But sometimes you completely stuff up. I quit my job in London because I was burnt out from working 100-hour weeks and decided that I was going to travel the world for 6 months and do lots of fun things. This was in February 2020. So I spent 6 months having dinner with my parents every night, just around the corner from here, locked down in Melbourne, as many of you were as well. I became the Liberal candidate for Kooyong, and I did that through a pre-selection process where a lot of people said to me, I sat down with a number of people, members of the Liberal Party, different people, and they said, oh, you know, you're a woman of your age, you know, maybe you should consider state politics because that's better for families. You know, it's going to be a bit hard with the kids, you know, if you're going to Parliament and all that sort of thing in Canberra. I sort of looked at them and said, well, I don't have kids, but thank you for your advice. And, you know, when I was the candidate, it wasn't always easy, although it was something that I chose. I'd knock on people's door and say, hi, I'm the Liberal candidate for Kooyong, and people would just sort of scream profanity at me, and then I'd sort of go, okay, right, I'm going now. And it often wasn't to do with me. They were just having a bad day. You know, I'd turned up to their door, they didn't want to talk to me, that's all fine. Things happen. But in the end, diamonds are formed by compression and heat. You might be in positions where things don't go right and you feel like, you know, everything's terrible. You've made a bad decision. You didn't get what you wanted. But that's an opportunity to learn. That's an opportunity to say, look, I am stronger. I am better. I knocked on one guy's door and we were having a good conversation. He was telling me about crime in the local area, and then his wife comes out, and I think she thought I was sort of keen on, I was sort of there to, you know, sort of say, hi, I'm here for your husband, I don't know. And she started screaming at me and said, what are you doing at my door? Why are you talking to my husband? I said, well, I'm a political candidate. And she kept screaming at me. And I wouldn't have wanted to be in that household that night, to be honest, after that conversation. But you have these circumstances where it's nothing to do with you, but it's tough. But can you pick yourself up and keep going? That is the most important thing. So the second thing I'd say is that you need to focus on the things that you can control over the things that you can't. There are so many things that you can't change in your life, and you could spend your entire life just worrying about them. You can't change who your parents are, you can't change where you were born or in what circumstance. But there's also things in your day-to-day life that you actually can't impact. I mean, I think about when I was in a campaign, yes, I had a good campaign manager, a good team, and I empowered that team. I entrusted them to go out there and do their job. And sometimes they got things wrong. There was a time where they went out and, you know, those famous signs that you probably saw all over the electorate. For some reason, someone picked up the wrong list and they put the signs on exactly the houses that had said no rather than the houses that had said yes. And I thought, oh, what am I going to do? This is terrible. And there was nothing I could have done. Sometimes people stuff up, right? And I said, okay, look, I'm just going to call every single one of these houses and I'm going to apologise profusely and say, I'm really sorry, but you've got a massive photo of my face on your fence. And so these things happen. And instead of worrying about, oh, what should I have done? What can I do? How do I change the past? How do I undo that? You go, well, look, it's happened. How do we move on? What's the next step? How do we move forward? There was, you know, during the campaign, I had a bunch of social media abuse. At one point, I was getting an abusive message every 10 seconds. Not from people who lived locally, often from bot farms that sort of, there was one particular guy who kept sending me these messages about how he thought I had a really gummy smile. And, and I thought, this is a particularly niche way to insult someone. If you're going to go about it, like, and it has stuck in my mind, in fairness to this guy. That he did actually manage to get under my skin with this kind of comment. But you just constantly get, but I couldn't control that. And to be honest, it didn't matter what people thought. All you do is you just keep going and you keep talking to people and you keep trying to do your best and control the things you can control. I can't control 1,000 people across Australia who want to, you know, put comments on my social media. There's nothing I can do about that. What I can do is I can get up every day, I can keep talking to local people, I can keep knocking on doors, I can keep going out and doing media, and I can keep being positive and leading my team. And that was what was important, and that was what I focused on. I think the last thing to think about is that you've got to remember that your subjective experience of what is hard is not necessarily the same as anyone else's. And even if things are hard for you, it's still so important to treat other people really well and with respect. You know, some people hate public speaking. I'm sure there are some people in this room who don't like public speaking, and some of you probably love it. But that experience of what is hard is different for different people. And, you know, just because things might seem good for someone on the outside, someone might seem like they have a fantastic life, that everything's great, doesn't mean that they're good on the inside. I worked with, you know, I worked in banking in London, and, you know, this was incredibly on a trading floor of a global investment bank, incredibly highly paid people doing amazing work, really interesting work that they found terrific and really engaging. But I had 2 colleagues who died by suicide because underneath it all, they really weren't happy. And the reality is that what you see on the outside is not necessarily what's going on the inside. So be compassionate to one another, because you never know when you'll need that support in the same way as well. A colleague of mine was, just to finish, was flying home to Melbourne once with me for Sydney, and I think this underscores the importance of kind of treating people well. We'd just checked our bags, and we'd been on a work trip, and a client had just emailed him, and he said, "Look, I need you in Perth tomorrow, rather than Melbourne." This guy really wanted to go home to see his kids because we've been away a few days, and he was really pissed off. He went, "I don't want to go to Perth, and I'm going to have to change my flight now. We're already checked in. How are we going to do it? You know, because I've got to be there tomorrow morning, and if I fly to Melbourne and I fly out, it's just not going to work, so I'm going to have to change my flight." I said, "Okay, well, why don't we just go to the check-in, the service desk, and you can get them to change your flight." And you know, he was talking to the lady, and she said, "Oh, look, it's a bit difficult," and he just lost it with her. He lost it. He was grumpy as hell, and he wanted to get home, and he said, you know, and he cracked it. And you know, she said, "Well, look, you're already checked in," and all this. And eventually she said, "Look, I found a solution. I got you on a flight to Perth, but it's leaving now. So here's your ticket. Off you go." And this guy, he grabs the ticket out of her hand aggressively and sort of rushes off, and you know. And I was sort of a bit embarrassed, and I sort of thought, God, he's had this big meltdown, this big episode in front of everyone, just treating this poor woman so terribly. And she sort of looked a little bit taken aback, and then sort of had a little smirk on her face. And I said, I sort of wanted to keep the peace and make her feel a bit better. And I said, "Oh, wow, it's really impressive that you managed to get him to Perth." And she said, "Yeah, he's going to Perth, but his bag's going to Melbourne." So thank you all very much, and well done on all being here and on the fantastic organisation.